Good afternoon. We are here for the Zoning Code Rewrite Citywide Advisory Committee. The date is September 29th, 2022. And we'll go ahead and get started. We have a lot of really good information to cover with you. We're going to start off with some Module 3 information. Then we're going to talk a little bit about community outreach because we're going to head back out. So we want to make sure that you know the dates and can invite any of your constituencies to any of those events or invite us to come visit them, whether they're an organization or a group. We can certainly do those targeted outreach efforts as well. And then we want to talk about some of the upcoming Citywide Advisory Committee meetings. How far do you guys want to take the path with us? Do you think it's valuable to continue to meet through January, through full adoption? What is ultimately your thoughts on and how you can best participate? And when we talk about participation, I think it's also a really good reminder about what the Citywide Advisory Committee is. We often get asked questions, what does the Citywide Advisory Committee do? And so the Citywide Advisory Committee is unique members from throughout the city of Boise that are our sounding board. And so they're listening to ideas, making sure that information is accurate, concise, clear, and really accomplishing the goals of the city before we take it out to the public. So ultimately not decision makers, but very, very important to raise flags where they're appropriate, to provide key information to us, to make sure that we're collecting and creating the best information that we can. So I think that is a good start to where we're at. Oh, I could start my video too. And then if we could go to the next, perfect. So we went through a lot of that information. I know that we're also going to have some attendees at the end as well. And so we'll go ahead and leave that normal 10-minute period for those individuals to ask us questions or to share their thoughts. So when we get into draft module 3, it's important to remember that draft module 3 really talks about the process and the procedures. So who's reviewing what application, how individuals can participate in the process, no matter who you are, whether you're an agency, a neighborhood association, a community member, a neighbor, even an interdepartmental component of the city of Boise. It kind of identifies that process where you can participate and how we can collaborate with you. So when we went out for the revised module 1 and module 2 outreach, we heard some preliminary feedback, which was really nice because it allowed us to bridge that gap from those allowed uses that we heard in module 1 to some of those design standards in module 2. But people continually said, hey, consistent and predictable decisions is key, and that it was really something that was important to them. They also wanted us to coordinate all of our conversations with all of our partners. And so whether that was transportation, and we heard that often from you, how can VRT be a part of the process? How can ACHD or ITD be a part of the process? The community said that as well. So they really want us to work with all those public service providers to make sure that we can all coordinate together. Our capital improvements plans can all be in alignment with one another as we grow, so that we're all growing together. And then the last thing that we heard was clear roles for stakeholders. So people wanted to know not only when they could participate, but how they could best participate as well. So when we took that, we ultimately created, so before we had a very clear message of ensuring that we were securing the city's edge. And so we were avoiding sprawl, that we were valuing neighborhoods in various sizes. And we want to continue that story. And so with module 3, this is going to be our first question. So we wanted to kind of boil that down, and what is the message that we're trying to send out, and comments that we want to receive is our development process will reinforce our desired outcomes. So it will ultimately, we're creating the rules and regulations that are going to create things that allow the city to prosper over time. Involving our community partners early to ensure our concept meets our desired outcomes. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're getting those excellent projects that we're seeking. And so I guess just to stop there, do you think our messaging is right with process and procedure? And this doesn't have to be the end of that conversation. It can certainly evolve as we talk throughout the day. And of course, as you have time to think about it, you might send a midnight note as well. But does that really capture what Module 3 does and reflect what we've heard from our community and developers with those consistent, predictable decisions, creating those clear stakeholders, and then, of course, making sure that people are involved at the right time and coordinating efforts? Oh, and then if you could identify your name too for our constituency.
Okay, this is Richard Llewellyn. I would ask, to me, they generally seem good. But in terms of kind of magnitude of effort in each of these directions, how does it relate to the existing state? So do we want to have more public input or less, et cetera? So that maybe it doesn't belong in this exact high level overview, but maybe it does. So just quick thought.
And Ben.
Yeah, Ben Zamzo. I think this covers a lot of it. This talks about the predictability of the process, but what is important to our firm as a developer and other colleagues is also the predictability of the timeframes involved. And I know that the process will change as a lot of design review gets lumped into the actual building guidelines, and understanding how the development community's expectations should change in terms of review times. And I know that doesn't go into the code, but should be part of the conversation on the outreach.
I think both of those conversations are very valuable, and I think we're going to start to take a dive into what those processes look like, and then determine, when do people participate and when can they make an impact on the decision and how we frame that. So if we're comfortable with all of that, anybody else have any thoughts on the initial messaging? Because ultimately this is going to be the foundation that we build on as we move forward. And you're going to see some of that. Go ahead, Byron.
This is Byron Falwell. I'm just wondering if, as we move into Module 3, specifically about the process and the city processes being fairly labyrinthine for people to understand, should some of our messaging really be outwardly facing and talking about education of the process, or at least reduction or paraphrasing that process? Just a thought.
No, I think that's a good point. And I think it is important to make the information understandable, clear, concise. And so that might fall into that category.
I think a note on that would be really helpful for today. Do you all have a lens on is this is a lot of information that we're going to be sharing with you. And at many points, we can take very deep dives and have discussions about the relationship with all that. And that is, what we want to do and continue to do, but is it too much too soon? Is the order right? How do we explain this in a simple way? And then also give that ability to really get into the details if somebody wants. So it might be something like you hear it for the first time today, and then we need to continue the dialogue. Absolutely, we're gonna have to continue the dialogue because there's a lot.
Yes. And so as we kick off with that, but I mean, ultimately, when we talk about reinforcing our desired outcomes, so this is kind of our compass. So we are thinking that we would like to create application types, and we're going to take a deep dive into what that means as well. But keep that in mind. Creating a new application type, which is going to have, if it's an allowed use, it still needs to meet the allowed form Or if there's an alternative form that's proposed, there would be a separate process that you would go through. Establishing what is we're calling an interdepartmental review process. Reintroducing the hearings examiner, so they could be a decision-making body. Our design review committee would transition into a full commission, very similar to the Historic Preservation Commission. And then taking a deep dive into what are our findings for our application. So really updating those so that they reflect what we as a city are looking for. And so we're going to go into each one of those, and I'm going to take you through the creation of that application types. And so what do we mean by when we say creating application types? Ultimately, we've created 4 categories, which are a little bit different. And so that type 1 is going to be a very simple review process. And so that's something that does not require a lot of effort in review. It's going to be relatively simple. Do you meet that criteria or do you not? And so we can get you in and out very quickly. So in some cases, it might be over the counter. In some cases, it might be a day or 2, but it's going to be a relatively quick process because it's not going to require a lot of collaboration externally or internally. Type 2 applications are administrative reviews. And so with module 2, we spent a lot of time talking about some of those use-specific standards and some of those design criteria. And so ultimately, those use-specific standards, if somebody proposes a duplex, we would review the duplex against those standards and do they meet them or not. So that's going to require a little bit more time and maybe some coordination with some of our internal departments, but those would all be reviewed administratively. Now, there's a caveat. There is some applications that might be difficult and might require additional collaboration, and we would send those to the interdepartmental review committee. But we're going to tell you a little bit about what those are, and we're also going to identify what types of applications fall into each one of these buckets too. So those 2 are pretty much administrative, and so those are what we agree on as a city, that nope, these are uses that are allowed, but we have some standards that go with them. There's setbacks, there's building heights, parking requirements, those types of things, but we can get those out the door. Type 3 applications are going to go to an appointed body for their review and their decision, as well as type 4. And as we review those, they're going to be evaluating to ensure that we're getting those excellent projects. They're making sure that we're getting the desired outcomes that we're looking at. And so we'll go through those. And it's interesting too, when we talk about type 3 and type 4, some of those are dictated not necessarily by our process, but by the state of Idaho. So the Local Land Use Planning Act actually requires us to notice for certain applications, and they require public hearings for some applications. So we're going to take a deep dive into what that is as well. So when we talk about some of those examples for those type 1 reviews, so if you have a temporary sign, that's going to be a relatively simple process. We're looking at the square footage. We're clearly communicating that you're allowed to do that for X amount of days. We can approve you either over the counter or within just a few days to get you well on your way. Those type 2 administrative approvals, that's going to be like your record of survey. It might be a minor small lot. So sometimes people have referred to those as substandard lots, but we've kind of expanded that category because with the creation of some of our newer zones or the reduction in lot sizes, some of those are going to fall into that category. So that's a minor small lot. Non-conforming uses, if we have larger developments that are coming in with sign programs, group childcare facilities, accessory dwelling units, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. We have some other zoning permits that we have in a category. Some of those, for example, might be a mural. And so that requires us to coordinate with our arts and history department. We also have a river system permit that is also us working closely with our public works department. So you're going to see as we get down, there's some more collaboration that needs to be done. minor design review applications, and then those uses that we've deemed allowed that are appropriate in the zone, and they meet all of our allowed forms. Those are also all going to be reviewed administratively because they are ultimately achieving and reinforcing our desired outcomes. Type 3 applications, variances, while they are not required to have a public hearing in local land use planning act, they do require noticing. And so that's why you're going to find that in that type 3 category. When we are expanding those non-conforming uses, conditional use permits, that's actually required by the local land use planning act. Then we're going to have some of our complex hillside applications as well as river system, because again, that's going to take some collaboration. We may need to work with some external outside agencies. Large design review projects. So what does that mean? Over 5,000 square feet for commercial or office districts, or over 10,000 square feet for industrial. So we'll continue to run those through the hearing process. Major small lots. So you saw minor small lots in type 2. What's the difference? Type 2 is if you have 4 or less units. Type 3 is we're saying, hey, we think that somebody else needs to review it other than the administrative staff. So 5 or greater units is what's going to define that. And then those certificate of appropriatenesses that are also clearly defined currently as well. And then those type 4, we know that those are not only going to require some interdepartmental collaboration with that interdepartmental review, but they're also going to need city council final approval. So those are your comprehensive plan amendments, rezones or zoning ordinance amendments, planned unit developments, and subdivisions. So those are all. So we've tried to organize them in simplicity and the amount of collaboration that is taking place. And so there's 2 items that are bolded on here. So the very last one on type 2 applications is the allowed use and allowed form, as well as in type 3, it's the second one down, the allowed use or the alternative form. We're going to talk to you a little bit about that because that's ultimately the next item that we're going to talk about. And so we're going to go into a little bit more detail with that. And so before we go there, we want to make sure, is the purpose of categorizing these applications, does it seem reasonable? And then really thoughts on how they're organized. Does it make sense? Is it clear? Is it understandable? Are we going to be able to communicate this effectively?
Andrea, this is Andy Erstead. Good afternoon. I have a couple just real quick questions. The types 1 through 4, 1 and 2 seem to be really straightforward and can be handled at an administrative level. And 3, 4 are obviously public hearing notice conditions. Is there a desire or a goal to try and have types 1 and 2 non-appealable, or just a matter of course because they meet all of the criteria and are allowed?
So we have had that discussion quite thoroughly internally, and based on what we came up with is our legal department has said it's always good to have checks and balances, and it's always good for people to be able to be heard when it's appropriate. And so what would happen and what we will propose, or what we believe we're going to propose through module 3, is that if you have a type 1 or type 2 application that's administratively approved, you could appeal that decision, but you could appeal it to the hearings examiner. And so that is an independent individual that has a legal background. And so they're truly going to evaluate what that criteria is. Did staff make an accurate determination? And if they did, that decision would stay. If not, the decision would of course be overturned. But what that does is that allows us to get an internal checks and balances, and making sure that we have a second set of eyes, that we've made the correct determination, but it eliminates those other steps. So rather than going to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council before we go to the district court system, the hearings examiner would be reviewing it in that capacity.
Okay, I think that the reason for the question, and I've actually had this question from some other people, was they're taking away our rights, and I'm saying no. If these are totally allowable and totally conforming actions within a parcel of ground, there's really no rights to appeal it. Although there's no need to appeal it because it follows under the guidelines. And so I like the idea that you've had the internal discussion and the hearing examiner would be that person. I think one of the goals from my perspective as we've been working through this whole thing is clarity of process, clarity of allowance, clarity of use. And I appreciate your response on that, on types 1 and 2.
Comments a little bit in response to Andy there. So we'd like to believe that if allowed uses.
Oh, Richard, I think will you turn on your mic? Your mic.
It'll be green.
Sorry.
And you can move it closer.
Oh, then I can leave it off. Okay.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. I could have just talked. But I think, for instance, the Blue Valley case is informative here. Blue Valley, it's back in the news and it's back threatened once again by this time potentially heavy industrial development next to it. And it's really in this situation because of mistakes made, both lack of public participation, which the planning and zoning commissioners have made clear in the past that when they were annexed into the city as industrial, there was just almost no public participation from Blue Valley community. So errors were made. Nonetheless, entitled uses continue. And there are circumstances, as this one, in which the general, for instance, even police powers of a city could very well be called in to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens in these cases, or other clauses that are clearly written into the code. For instance, in this case, industrial uses should not create hazardous condition. So those are subjective to some extent, and they require, I believe, public input. And so to say, yes, if it's an allowed use, then there is no reason for the public really to participate, I think is hopefully the case more often than not, and I think it is. But there certainly are exceptions, and the exceptions can be devastating to people's lives. So I'll get off that. You'll probably hear me bring up Blue Valley again, because I do think it's informative, but there are lots of other perhaps smaller situations in which the decisions and uses are not necessarily clear-cut, even if they should fall into a category of an allowed use. So in terms of, I'll leave it at that for the time being. Thanks.
Richard, I think when I kicked off this originally, we talked about refining what those findings are, and that'll be part of our goal as we are creating findings for rezones or annexations or whatever entitlement that you're looking for, that we have clear objective standards, that they're predictable, and so that we eliminate some of that subjectivity. And then just in the example that you've provided, I mean, ultimately Blue Valley, some of that is getting our dimensional standards right, which we reviewed as part of module 2. So if you are a residential district or a residential use, you're adjacent to industrial, maybe you provide an additional setback. And so you're going to see that in the code as it's written, that some additional setback is required for residential adjacent to industrial. And so you're going to start to see how all of these things fit together, but those are good examples. And so hopefully that gives us a good ideology. And then also when we look at this too, I think it's important, the items that we highlighted in green, the reason we highlighted those is because they go above and beyond what the local land use planning act require as far as noticing in public hearings. So we're saying that these are important and they might impact those neighbors. So major expansion of non-conforming uses or those complex hillside or river system permits those very large design review, those could impact those neighbors. And so we want to have a hearing. So these are items that go above and beyond what the local land use planning act would require of the city. Yeah, Callie.
So Kelly Tag, can you define on type 2 what a non-conforming use would be?
A non-conforming use ultimately means that you were in existence prior to the zoning code that is in existence. So oftentimes our non-conforming uses today are you built a tire changing center on 28th Street in an R1C zone, but it was prior to 1966. So there weren't any rules and regulations in, but you were already built. So we recognize you as a legal non-conforming use.
Okay, so just to clarify, so let's say in that scenario, if they wanted to modify or change the property, then that would be the reason why they would need to apply for an administrative review?
So they would be establishing a legal non-conforming use through type 2, the type 2 application, which is administrative. And oftentimes you need those for your financial documentation. So if you're taking out a loan, a bank wants to know that, yeah, you might not be an allowed use, but you are legal non-conforming. And so that's what that is. But then you're going to notice in the type 3 category next door, if you want to expand that non-conforming use, now we think that a review body is appropriate. We think that the community should be able to talk about those things. And so that's why you're going to find that in the type 3 category. Any other thoughts as we?
Briefly, Richard Llewellyn. Yeah, so where I see the what seems subjective, and maybe they aren't, but in that one, it seems like it would be non-conforming use or major expansion. Some of those things can be quantitatively defined. I'm not sure if that one can be.
20% or greater.
Oh,
So,
there you
yeah.
go. Okay, yeah, to the extent that they all can be quantitative, I think that
Yes,
will
to
really
make
help.
them objective, to
yeah.
take that subjectivity out.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Just have a quick clarification. The difference between type 3 and type 4, when we say type 4 council review, are we talking about city council?
Yep.
Okay, and so all of the commission level review is in type 3.
Correct. So
Gotcha.
you're going to find the hearings examiner might fall into some of those. You're going to have your planning and zoning commission, your historic preservation commission, and your design review commission, because as we talked about a little bit earlier, they're transitioning from a committee to a commission.
Right.
But also type 4 will go to their lower level approval. So for plan, like a comp
recommendation.
plan
right.
amendment will go
Type
to
3
planning and
first.
zoning. But because of LUPA, it also has to go to council.
Right.
It's a final
Okay, thank
council
you.
approval.
Yeah, this is Byron, by the way. Sorry, I forgot that
Oh,
part.
Jessica.
One quick question too, and this is sort of like off the beaten path a little bit, but the difference between notification and hearings are, notifications are often linked with hearings. Has there been any discussion about whether or not notifications can be separated? And I'm kind of like looking for, and I'm not trying to create daylight between type 2 and type 3, but there is some like benefit to notification via administrative review. And I'm wondering if some elements in type 3 could get reclassified into type 2 if they were notified, but don't necessarily need a hearing, if that makes sense. Making sure that the neighbors in the neighborhood are informed of an upcoming change. If that upcoming change is so closely aligned with what's already an allowed use in the new code, then maybe a notification would be appropriate, but a hearing would be extraneous, I guess. Has that discussion happened internally, or can you see what I'm getting at?
We have talked about it, and just so you know, through our discussions, we actually had 5 buckets originally, and we've consolidated down to 4. So as we talk about some of those things, though we could, those are things that, we can explore as we continue forward. They were just particular items that had sometimes life safety attached when we talk about those complex hillside and river system, or that it was going to be a larger change in a neighborhood. So we thought that those should be recognized. So, we're certainly open to suggestions as we talk about some of these things. And maybe it is going back and evaluating those standards that have been established through Module 2. Marissa.
This is Marissa. So I'm just trying to understand your chart here. So the type 3, the variances and the conditional use permits, those would also go on to city council, right?
They do not.
They would not.
Nope.
Okay.
So when we talk about who's making the decision, so that level above tells us who that decision maker is. So the simple review and the administrative review is a staff level person. And then when we go to an appointed body, that's going to be our commissions. And then our council level review, that is ultimately the council. So those are your end decision makers.
Okay. And right
but,
now, who is the final decision maker for CUPs and variances?
Planning and Zoning Commission.
PNCs. Okay.
But then type 3 is appealable to council.
Yes.
Okay. So it's similar.
You still
to how
have,
it is now.
yep, you still have
Okay.
your appeal process. So if you are unhappy or feel like the Planning and Zoning Commission didn't accurately review the application and come to the right determination, you have the ability to appeal that the one time. So it would go to city council before it goes on to the district court system.
If I could clarify one thing, I think variance, as it's proposed, and we have it in a next slide, variance goes to the hearing examiner. As proposed.
That is a different one.
Yes. And then we have, Ian has his hand up, and then I saw that Andy had his up as well. So Ian, do you want to?
Yeah, this is Ian McLaughlin. I guess between the different types, do we have any idea of, we're talking about the option to, appeal type 2s. I mean, is there any predictability on the timeline between these? I mean, because potentially not, trying not to add time to projects that are allowed uses or by right, but maybe a little bit different or a little more complicated. I guess is there any, I'm sure you've thought about it, but is there any thought on how the timelines of these different types of reviews pan out? And maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit.
Yes, so we've thought quite extensively about the process and timing and how that happens. I mean, ultimately, when you are allowed to, so today, if you had an administrative approval and that was appealed, it potentially, if it goes to the design review committee, it would be appealed from staff to the design review committee. If you are unhappy with that decision, you could move on to the Planning and Zoning Commission. If you were unhappy with that, you could go to the city council before you went to the district court system for that ultimate determination. So we're proposing that we shorten that, but still acknowledge that appeals may be appropriate. Staff can error. And so the public does have the right to appeal that decision. They would appeal it to the hearings examiner. But at that point, if they were unhappy with that decision, they would take it to the district court system. So it eliminates some of those other layers. But it makes sure that, the checks and balances are there, that people are making the right decision, and allows people to participate in the process.
Andrea, my question is, in terms of the change of design review from a committee level to a commission level, and I think I'm picking it up on it right now. If you go into a type 3 and it's a design review decision, it's not a planning and zoning decision, somebody challenges that decision as either an error or the basis of challenge. That goes from the design review commission up to city council. It doesn't then go up to planning and zoning. We're short circuiting it right up to the city council, correct?
That's correct. So removing that middle layer. So we still have that one appeal opportunity as we're moving forward, and we still have that checks and balances. People can still participate in the process, but acknowledging that humans make error.
Rarely.
Rarely. Yeah, Shellen.
Thanks. This is all good work and I think I'm following it. But I wanted to make sure I understood. Sorry if you said it and I just missed it, but in the type 3, if it's appealed, do all of them go to council or do some of them go to a third party hearings commissioner first?
It would depend how it's structured. So a hearings examiner would likely go to planning and zoning. A planning and zoning, a design review, or historic preservation decision would be appealed to city council. And so there would not be an appeals board. We did talk about, what does that mean? How could we evaluate that? And we felt that our council could make really good decisions. Planning and zoning could also make really solid decisions. And then the integration of the hearings examiner also allows us to have a little bit of independent outside view as well on our system.
Okay, and then I guess the follow-up, and maybe it's getting into the weeds and we can just punt it because maybe it's not important for this at this juncture, but does the hearing examiner, where I'm coming from, I'll try to explain where I'm coming from so that then you can try to help me understand. My concern is that sometimes appealing to the council can put the council in scenarios where they might not fully understand legal ramifications of their decisions. And I think that generally the, council's sophisticated enough to do that. And maybe that's where you all landed, but I'm just wondering what type of, if that hearings commissioner or whatever you called it, is also looking at it from, is that what they're doing? Looking at it from a legal perspective?
Yes, they are. So typically they have a legal background. So they're
Okay.
a retired judge is often utilized. Sometimes an individual that is a land use attorney. And so they're
Okay.
a contract individual working on behalf of the city.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Maybe I missed it earlier. Thanks for playing.
And then we have Jessica, followed by Hillary.
Hello, this is Jessica Aguilar. Hey, I like the hearing examiner idea. I think that's great. A question, if let's say there's a design review application and it gets approved, but there's a member of the community that wants to appeal it, but they're appealing it, say, for a land use concern, not necessarily a design concern, because that happens quite a bit. We have folks that come to DR and they're not happy about the use when it is an approved use. Is there a way or a stopgap that they can't go on to the hearing examiner if their issue of concern is something that's already, like a land use, for example, is an approved use? Or will they still get the opportunity to be heard at the hearing examiner? Hopefully that question made sense.
No, it certainly does. So ultimately, we need to clearly define our decision makers' rules and the roles that they hold. And so we are proposing to keep design review the same. So they're reviewing the design of the project. So they're reviewing all of the architectural and the aesthetic components that go with that. Land use decisions would still be with planning and zoning. So we as staff, as appeals come in, we can, of course, go through it with an individual and say, this is an allowed use, so we can discourage them, but they could always utilize the process. But we will be a sounding board, will be available to advise them, whether that is a design criteria or a land use specific criteria, because that's going to be very important as we define roles and duties. And you're going to see that in module 3. We have Hillary first and then Marissa.
I just have a question and maybe I missed it. I heard you say that the hearing examiner is appealable to planning and zoning? Is the hearing examiner's decision always appealable to planning and zoning, or is it just sometimes appealable? I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is it seems like that's becoming a pro forma. If it's always appealable, it's just going to be a pro forma step to a public hearing. Like, is there anything where the hearing examiner's ruling is going to have teeth?
Ultimately, yes. So they would be the stop for any appeal going through the administrative process. However, the hearings examiner could be making the determination for a variance, because we would like to send our variances to the hearings examiner. Now, if somebody wanted to appeal their decision, that's what would go to planning and zoning. So
Got it. So it's for the type 3 stuff.
correct. So
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, the key is to think of this, and because we have another slide that talks about the appointed bodies, but what here it's by type. So the decision, so type 2 is an administrative decision and it can be appealed to the hearing examiner and then it stops. Type 3 goes to a commission. It can be appealed and it gets appealed all the way up to city council eventually.
Okay, thank you.
And after Marissa's question, maybe now that we've kind of walked through all the types, to then go to the next piece about the different decision-making bodies. And then there's also noticing as a piece that we want to talk about. So we can always come back to and talk through this again.
yeah, so go ahead and take it away, Marissa.
So can you explain a little bit about the hearing examiner and who that, is it one person? Will it be like different people? Who that person is?
So typically it is one person. It's a contract individual. Like we said, they're an individual that's experienced with law and typically land use. So a retired judge, a land use attorney, somebody of that nature that has a good understanding of what that is. And ultimately, they would be taking a lot of what we're seeing go to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So we believe that we can get some of those minor requests outside of the larger public hearing process. Now, Planning and Zoning and City Council, we've lessened their schedules so they can maybe making those important policy decisions. And we're actually looking at it objectively through some outside eyes as well.
Okay. I think my only caution with that is if a retired judge versus like if you have an active land use attorney, making sure there's no conflict of interest there, because I mean, Richard can attest to how difficult it is to find any attorney that does not have some prior relationship with a developer that would even talk to you. And so just making sure the appearance of nothing bad.
Impropriety, certainly. That's good advice. Ben.
Could you give some examples on the allowed use alternate form, what you think the most common instances of that would be?
Yes, hold tight. That's the next slide. Right on the edge of your seat, I know. Hillary, did you have something right before we move on?
Yeah, and this is just a comment. Just generally for the legal community in defense of my community a little bit. Yeah, it's very true that people that do real estate are a small community. And yes, we all have at some point or another represented a developer. We have also at some point or another represented individuals who are contesting one sort of decision or another. And we have also, many of us, represented public entities. We have done all of those things. And while we are always an advocate for our client, while we are representing our client, that certainly doesn't mean that we bring those biases when we are sitting as an independent arbiter. And it certainly doesn't mean that we bring those biases into anything like this, where we're providing our own personal input or where we are serving as a member of the public or serving in capacity where we're serving the public good. So you know, I get it. I understand why people have concerns about that. But it really, lawyers, despite all of the stories out there, they do take their roles very seriously. And I think anybody that the city would appoint in the role of a hearing examiner would take his or her responsibility very seriously to be impartial.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Ben, hold on. We're going down this road.
All right. So is everybody's awake? Okay, strap in. Let me just back up for 1 second, which is helpful that it's at the top of this slide. So to kind of link these ideas together, because I think that'll help our explanation of this component of module 3. So going back to those modules 1 and 2, one of the key parts of our framework is that we want our code to reinforce our desired outcomes, right? And we also do that through our development and our design standards and all the different parts of our code. So that's step 1. Step 2, which we just went over, is that we have, we're now introducing this idea of allowed use and allowed form, or allowed use and alternative form. And so these two concepts are going to be very much tied together. So keep that in mind, reinforcing desired outcomes, and then thinking about the specific form of an allowed use and how it does or does not reinforce desired outcomes. So what you can see here on this map, we tried to map it out for you to show specifically that this applies in specific zones. And my apologies, it's a little hard to read. We keep refining this map. So if you have any input on what's hard to see on it, let us know and we'll update it. But what you can see there is the R1B and R1C parcels that meet the locational criteria for the strategic infill incentive, if you'll remember that from the last time. There's also the MX 1, 3, 4, and 5 zones. So those neighborhood mixed uses, active corridors, TOD nodes, and then the downtown mixed use areas. And then on the right-hand column there, you can see that these are the allowed uses within these zones that could have either an allowed or alternative form. So I'm going to run through a specific example of this in the MX3 zone in a second. But take a look at that map before I move on, just so you can kind of set the stage for where locationally in the city this is proposed to apply. Okay, so walking through a specific example of this. So how would this actually work? Take the MX3 corridor, so Fairview, State, or Vista. What we're saying here is that multifamily is an allowed use in the MX3 zone. However, not all types of multifamily development are the same. And the idea is that we want to reinforce our desired outcomes. And again, we want to put development where we have planned public investment, where our development or our density can support our transit goals and support our walkability goals. Well, it really depends, and it's really important what type of use is being deployed there, what the form is. So on the left hand there, you see what would be considered an allowed use or an allowed form. So you have an apartment building and it's 4 stories or greater. So it's really making good use of that limited resource of having land right on a transit corridor. That would be considered a staff level review with interdepartmental review. So what that means is that would be an administrative decision. Staff would review against all of those development and design standards that we have worked out in modules 1 and module 2. And then we would also have an interdepartmental review. So that would be a gathering of all of our agency partners, ACHD, Public Works, Fire, making sure that all of those people are in the room together to review that application, so that there's consistency in the feedback and there's consistent coordination amongst those agencies to get the most excellent project that we can. And I want to make one clarification point here, which is, I think somebody has pointed out, which was good, is that, there's a difference between the design of a project and the use of a project. So this is talking about the question here is the use, but they may still need to apply for a design review permit, and that would be a separate procedure, right? So if it's a major design review, that's going to go to the design review commission. So just want to make sure there's clarity that those two things are separate, because I find that very confusing. On the right-hand side, you have the allowed use conditional form, I'm sorry, alternative form. I misspoke. So what you have there is you can see, yes, it's multifamily, but it's 3 stories or less. It's much more of a suburban type form, and it doesn't contribute as well to those goals that we have of really wanting to put development where we have planned public investment. We're still getting a project that is spreading out our land uses, that is creating seas of parking, which doesn't help us meet our walkability goals. Now, the idea here is not to say that I'm not looking at these pictures and saying as a staff member, well, like this one is good and this one is bad, but it's really taking a critical look at understanding what is the purpose of our hearing bodies, right? And those hearing level reviews. Maybe there's a way in which the project on the right does contribute to citywide goals, and it's really great and amazing, and that's okay because it is an allowed use. But the goal here is to say that we have these really great design criteria and we have staff that are trained in the code that can review those consistently. If it's that alternative form, we need additional checks and balances there to say, you know, our resources as a city are precious, and how we develop is really important, and how we grow. So if this is the form that you're proposing, then there should be explanation at a public hearing and more investigation into how it does or does not contribute to the findings that are in module 3 and in what our desired outcomes that we've stated as a community through this process. Okay, so that was a lot, but Richard, go ahead.
Thank you, Richard. So when we look at those 2 different uses, the obvious thing to me is the magnitude of use here and the magnitude of impacts. And so the one that we're proposing to be allowed and go through administrative potentially has very large impacts. And I will step, and so this is maybe the disjunct between the current planning and the long-term planning worlds. For instance, in my neighborhood, we have some 4-story apartments planned along State Street. This was not allowed use, and so it went to planning and zoning. And planning and zoning agreed with the neighborhood, and actually the applicant as well, in a kind of a roundabout way, that there really needs to be a traffic signal on State Street at that location. It's yes, it's planned, but it could be planned and it could be 20 years down the road, like many things. And so it's only through the public hearing process that we had that agreement, that developer agreement put on to the PUD. That's another question I have, but now PUDs are in before city council. So that's something maybe we could discuss later. But at any rate, it was only through that public process in which the magnitude of the impact could be assessed. ACHD could be kind of in a roundabout way because they weren't very active in the first place, brought into the process only after the neighborhood said, this is crazy. And the developer agreed, the applicant agreed that there really needed to be a new traffic signal on State Street. But I see the public process as essentially the only way often, even when things are planned, to bring about these infrastructure changes in which we all need to occur. The question is, do they occur concurrent with the development and can mitigate the impacts, or do they occur who knows when? So yeah, so I look at the magnitude of those different categories there, and that's what concerns me, is if we remove the public from the larger impacts. There's quite a few times. I mean, I understand the counter argument, that NIMBYs are just getting in the way of the works, but a lot of times there are good and important.
Can I jump in on that
Yeah,
one though?
yeah.
Because the magnitude of that project, even in the new code, most likely would have triggered the need to rezone because of its size. And so it would still go to planning and zoning and then to city council, and could include a conditional use permit with that.
So let's see, so it's 224 units. What part would require the rezone? I'm just curious because
because of our the MX3 along State Street and the quarter block, that one is pretty deep.
So, right.
So that would have required a rezone of the R1, what we're now calling R1
Sure.
C. So there would still, the type 4 applications don't go just to council. They still would go in the way that they do now to planning and zoning first. And they could include conditions
Yeah.
to then go to council.
And I appreciate that. Of course, if the law was different, they may have designed the project differently so they could have avoided, they could have crammed everything up along State Street to avoid that. I mean, it would have been possible. So it's a moving landscape here.
And that is something that we are doing constantly with everything that we're proposing here and is looking at real live projects. What was the process? What was the outcome? What would the process be? Would that be the same outcome or not? And that the testing on this will continue throughout, all of the next 6, 7, 8 months of work. So, and it is good. The real life examples are worth kind of flushing through this.
Yeah, and 2, hold tight, because I think you're going to see that the process gets changed up a bit. And so even though it's an administrative approval, we are still going to have an interdepartmental coordination. So ACHD is still invited to the table. So we're going to talk about a number of those things as well. And the neighborhoods are going to have ways to identify that there's indicators that things are happening throughout their area so that they can provide input. So I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised as we move forward.
Liz, Richard, I hope so. And thank you for that. But I will say here, just the politics of the situation. The reason that we were able to get kind of ACHD on board was through the large public process that happens to be an election year, et cetera. It's something where public is leveraging the political hearing process in this case. I don't think if it was just backroom people with ACHD meeting that there would have ever been a traffic signal required at the new Duncan Ulmer realignment. So at any rate.
Richard, I know we want to move on to other comments, but I just want to thank you. I mean, I think that's a really good point. And I think it really speaks to something that we're hoping is clear in how we walk through this with the community during outreach, which is we've spent a lot of time as staff trying to think very critically about what is the purpose of each component of our process and our procedure, right? Of the public hearing process, of administrative reviews, of appeals, and not from the perspective of how can we just make it as simple and as efficient as possible. Yes, we want predictability of timeline and we want things to be efficient when they can be, but also, we are humans and not machines. It's a very, very complicated thing to build a city and to develop it. And so it's important to us that we really have clarity around how each piece of the process works so that those kinds of things don't get lost in the mix. And so that it's more clear for people how to participate and when, so that there isn't so much of that lift on the side of a community member or whoever to have to navigate the labyrinth entirely on their own, which can be, that itself can discourage people from ever wanting to participate in a public process again, which is not what we want. Go ahead, Roberta.
This is Roberta, and this is more clarification for the discussion that just happened with Richard and Jessica. What project on State Street are you referring to in the stoplight?
So there is a multifamily project that's being proposed on the corner of Duncan and State Street. If we look in the long-term street classification and street mapping system, Duncan will realign and there is a proposed signal there. So in the capital improvements plan, the signal is identified. Richard is commenting that, yes, it was programmed, it was in for design, all of those good things. But because of the development, they were able to move that forward in the capital improvements plan to make it happen earlier than what it was intended to on paper.
This is Roberta again. Thank you. And I find the case studies of lessons learned really helpful as we go further in this process. And I think I've seen some of that happen in some of the community outreach. So for people like a lot of people on this committee have development or architectural or particular neighborhood issues. But for me and a lot of the people I affiliate with don't, you know, so when I have a couple other comments that I'll add as far as the education process that came up earlier. So the case studies are really helpful, and the lessons learned both by the public and the city are really helpful too. So thanks.
Ben Zamzo, we talked a lot about max building heights in module 2, and I'm just wondering if I missed it or if this is a new topic, which is minimum building heights. And then I'm wondering, in addition, where this will live in the code. Will it be in the use table itself or in the dimensional standards? And then does this get appealed to planning and zoning or to the design commission? And then last thing, just on its very surface, first hearing about this, I worry about the amount of volume this will add to public hearings on how many people, depending on the scope of the minimum height restrictions. I think a lot of folks could be coming in with projects that don't hit the min heights for public hearing approvals.
I'll try, and then you can back me up if I don't have the answer. So this is Lena again. I think if I'm tracking what you're saying, so this would not be implementing a minimum height, as in like in the dimensional standards for an entire zone. It would, because that would require for all uses within that zone to hit a minimum height. So this is addressing, let me go back to this other slide for a second. This is addressing specific allowed uses within specific zones. So for example, for each of these uses in MX3, if it were an attached single family project, if it were a fourplex, a multifamily building, a retail sale, or a restaurant, each of those would have specific criteria that would make it either allowed use allowed form or allowed use alternative form within that zone. So instituting a minimum height would be a much broader brush. This gets a little more specific. The challenge of which always, of course, is that that's a little more complex, but then our hope is that it helps to not impose such arbitrary restrictions as something like a minimum height. Am I tracking that correctly, Andrea?
Is it just applied just to these uses then? There'd be minimum heights just for these uses in these zones?
And they're not necessarily minimum heights. So think about it as, so you have a maximum building height. Now you cannot exceed that, but now in use specific standards. So in the table of allowed uses, you're going to see that that's an allowed use, but at the very end column, that's going to identify that there's some use specific standards that go with that. You're going to have general standards that you meet. And then in these identified criteria, it's going to have some additional standards. And so now we're looking for 4 stories in height along some of those MX3 corridors. And if you are not meeting that, you just go through a different process. So you ultimately get to choose your adventure. So if you're going 4 or more stories, you go the administrative route. If you're going less than that, you're going to the Planning and Zoning Commission to tell them your story and your concept and how you contribute to the larger community. So you're choosing your adventure. You're still an allowed use, but there's a little bit different scenarios that go with that. So that's how you're going to know exactly what you're looking for. In the use table, are there use specific standards? There'll be general standards, and then there's going to be form standards. And so that's where that's all going to be clearly.
Were those already in the module 2 draft?
No, you're going to see that. Nope. You're going to see that with this upcoming one. We're still working on it. We're hoping that that'll come out mid-October, right before our first community outreach on October 13th.
And I think an important thing to note here, just to tie it back to, like, this is a tool to reinforce our desired outcomes. It's not happening in all mixed use zones. So you see MX2 isn't on this list, but it's saying we have these form standards that help support what we heard a lot of buy-in from the community, which was direct development where we have that investment. So making sure that our land use is actually helping to support that investment that we made.
Drew has his hand raised, I see. Yeah, just real quick, are you planning to walk through each of these examples today? Otherwise, that's my question. Or is the one that you provided just kind of a sample?
Drew, would you mind speaking up a little more? It's a little muffled.
Are you planning to walk through each of these examples or just the one sample that you gave? You not hear me?
I think we could walk through an example maybe towards the end of every single one of these, but right now in the phase, we still have a couple more things we want to present, but I think that's a good question. And we have some examples that we can give at the end.
Okay, great. Can you hear me better now, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
This is Byron. I think I'm generally in support of the allowed and alternative path. And I get why that can be a really great incentive to provide those desired outcomes that we're talking about. I think one thing, and I don't know if the other architects in the commission or the committee agree with this, but the use of the word form might be a little bit confusing if we're not talking about design standards, or if the alternative form doesn't apply to design itself. Maybe there's another word we can use there. I'm not really sure. And then the other item I would note is to Ben's question about stories. You know, our designs, our zoning standards really talk about building height, but not stories. Is that going to get kind of augmented, I guess, in the next draft, or are we talking about stories versus number of feet in height?
I think as we have thought through this process, we have evaluated stories and feet, and it comes into terms of height very differently. So we've kept those concepts separated from one another. But you're going to notice that, as Deanna had mentioned, when you start to see these allowed forms, which we have had discussions on, is that the right term, and is alternative and allowed the right terms as well? So if you have thoughts in regard to that, we're trying to nail that down to make it as clear and concise as possible. But it's going to be where we're placing those high public investments. And so you're going to have 60 feet that's available to you in that MX3 zone. We're saying you have to have 4 stories or greater. So you still have quite a bit of room to play with. It's not going to be where you're restricted at 35 feet in height, where you're having to achieve that. It's at those much greater heights is where we're leveraging these things.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
I don't see no hand raised, but Ian did put in the comment in the chat, maybe function instead of form, back to that comment that was made earlier, but no hands raised.
All right, then we'll move forward with the next component.
If not, I can just give it.
Hold tight for 1 second.
Andrea, while we're going back between slides, I may have a quick question for you and the group. The slide that you showed of Valor Point would be an approved use and allowed within the MX3 type 2 staff level with interdepartmental review. The reality of that illustration is shrouded in a more complicated use, and that was that it was basically a permanent supportive housing project, and there was an immense amount of resistance by the neighborhood, and we're seeing the same resistance across the street again, which would be in the MX3 zone. How do we address that the use is good, the review is straightforward, and the zone works, but there's immense neighborhood resistance? do we just automatically anticipate that we will still see the review process being kicked into an appeal?
I think that is not even just a local concern. I think it's a nationwide concern, specific to uses. So I can't promise that the appeal process may not be abused. But I guess I can tell you that the appeal process would be in place, and with hopes that that's the final checks and balances, that we've evaluated things correctly, we've used the objective criteria, and from then you can move on. So
okay. I just think it's as we're making sausage with this whole process, transparency is pretty important, and I like the fact that you chose a very controversial project to illustrate the goals and the desired outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. This is Lena again. And just one thing I'd like to add on to that additionally, again, when we're thinking about very deliberately about all these different pieces of the process and procedure. So one of the reasons why we've made the recommendation to reintroduce a hearing examiner is because it allows for some clarity around what exactly is the purpose of this hearing, right? So to have a hearing examiner allows us to have somebody with a legal background who is really digging into the question of, has the code been followed correctly? Has it been applied appropriately? As opposed to, is this just a free-for-all to open up the box and talk about every single component of it? That it's helpful to have clarity around what is being reviewed and what is up for discussion. And so hopefully that helps to add some predictability and some reliability to the process so that it's being used in the manner that it's intended, as opposed to being used for whatever other reason. So that clarity is very important.
And I think actually that lends well to the next couple of slides. So this kind of moves us into the next phase, which is we really want to design a process that will result in excellent projects. And that really starts with making sure that the stakeholders know their role and that the right applications are being reviewed by the body that's best fit to review that application. So again, and some of this we've already loosely been discussing. So we know we're going to have administrative review where the decision maker would be the director with a staff recommendation. And they're going to be reviewing that using those use-specific standards, making sure it complies to the zone district, and then it's meeting those use-specific standards and any other design guidelines. And those are, as we said, are going to be the application types 1 and 2. Then we have a review body. This is not a decision maker, but it is a body that will review an application, which I'll talk about in the next slide, which is our interdepartmental/agency review. And this will be a group that really provides subject matter expertise and helps coordinate the various different needs. So think fire department, ACHD, Valley Regional Transit. So folks who have specific land use or transportation expertise in making sure that they're coming to a project early on so that we can get the best project we can. And these are going to review some of those type 2, so ones that are complex or large in scale, as well as all applications that are type 3 or type 4. So if it's going to go to a public hearing, it will have had that interdepartmental review, and same if it's going to a public hearing at City Council. Our next review body will be the hearing examiner, so review body individual. And this is really going to help provide a lot of predictability to the process. So having objective and consistent review on specific applications. So this will be the hearing examiner will review all appeals from type 2 so that they could provide that consistent and objective review of did staff review this correctly and make the right decision. As well, they'll be tasked with some type 3 applications, which largely will be variances. So in that consistent, how are we applying the findings of a variance consistently? So we felt that that would be a really great efficiency to get out of moving variances to the hearing examiner. Again, we're elevating the design review committee to a commission, especially because we're really focusing on design and giving that commission more weight in terms of their decisions, right? We want a well-designed city, and we believe that this is one of the ways they can do it. They'll be reviewing. Marissa had that question, or was it Marissa, I think, about they're going to be making reviews on the architectural design. So that will be their scope of review. And that will be type 3 and 4 applications. Historic Preservation Commission, they'll be reviewing it according to the historic guidelines. And those are again 3 and 4. Our Planning and Zoning Commission makes the land use decisions, and then City Council makes policy decisions. And just a little bit more again about how we really feel that having an interdepartmental review committee or commission or group will help ensure that excellent projects. A lot of other cities have this as a formalized step, and we want to make sure that we're taking this. So we're hoping to bring together groups from Public Works, Parks, the Fire Department, ACHD, and ITD, so the Idaho Transportation Department, to make sure that we're having all eyes on a project early on in the process so that we can flag issues before a developer is too far down the line to adjust, or we're having to slow process down. So we have some process flow charts that you'll see where this falls in. We know that there'll be other groups that may need to be involved in projects as they come up. So whether it's police, CCDC, arts and history, the school district, irrigation districts, there's so many agencies that staff have to coordinate with. So how can we make this a bit more formal so that we're getting the best feedback we can, and also making the best project we can in the most smooth way, right? We're not finding out from someone much further down the road or waiting on something, and it's all coming to the table at once. Esther, this might is probably a good place to take a break too.
Okay. This is Esther. Just a quick question. As I look through Public Works, Parks, and Fire Department are all, you guys know the specific contacts there, but what does that look like for ACHD and ITD? Because you could say, hey, we want input from these agencies, and you're going to get input, but it's going to be input from an individual or individuals that may not be the most appropriate folks to provide pertinent feedback.
So with all of our agencies, we have clearly identified individuals. Typically, they're located near the top. So I'm going to use ITD, for example. So we have the District 3 engineer, which we notify. Then they're able to distribute it to their correct person. So we have an individual contact for all of our agencies. We have invited some of those agencies in and said, hey, what do you think about an interdepartmental review? Thus far, everybody's been very excited about it. Again, we need to work out some issues, but it'll be very similar to what a pre-application meeting is. So it'll be held on the same day so that everybody can plan accordingly, that an agency representative, if they're the right individual, they can block that time out so they know that they're going to be at the round table each Thursday or each Friday, whatever day we've identified. And so we've identified those partners. We think we've got some good days, and then we want it to be consistent as well. So we want to be meeting frequently so that we don't hold up the process, and that we're thinking about the timeline well so that we can keep everybody moving through the process. This is just happening much earlier, and the project isn't developed as far along. So, and you're actually going to see in one of the diagrams, so you can visually see the project is going to develop. So they're going to meet with us early on at 25%. So there's very minimal input that's gone into this. Then they're going to hold the neighborhood meeting because we've heard we want to be involved earlier and we want to understand what's happening so we can provide our input. Then they're going to go to the design or the interdepartmental review at about 50% concept review before we do a full blown. So it's going to take some training for a developer to know, yeah, you are going to want to come to staff early on to talk about your concept and help you form your site plan, but we're going to be along the way with you. So, but we're keeping in mind those timelines, how people want to be involved, when they want to be involved.
Ian, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think this is great. As a designer architect, we find that these pre-application meetings are great early ways to get our questions answered. I would encourage you to get as many people involved, people in groups involved in these meetings as possible. I would probably add on to some of the utilities groups if possible, Idaho Power if possible. But yeah, I think this is good.
This is Ben. I think I also really like what I'm hearing, but I just wanted to clarify, Andrea, you said it was like a pre-app meeting with ACHD and ITD. Are they actually in this process involved in a pre-app, or are they involved post-application, but it has the looks and feel of a pre-app, but you've already done the application?
So I've been trying to avoid the term pre-application because we have all come to know that as a process. But so we're using it as a similarity. So you call the city, you schedule a formal appointment, you meet with us on a Thursday, you get a time slot that's allowed. What's going to be different? Instead of 30 minutes, we don't want to rush you. We really want to talk about it, and we want to get everybody at the table. So we're inviting more people so that everybody understands that when fire says that aerial access has to be obtained because you have a 3-story building and you can't have urban street trees, that we can understand what that does. And so we can adjust those street tree spacing, we can adjust trash pickup, and then our hope is, as well as we're all around a table, we're going to learn that as you make an adjustment, you impact others as well. And so everybody is learning what's happening. So as you make a requirement, that might impact solid waste, or that might impact fire or accessibility, those types of things.
I love that. That sounds fantastic. My only concern is just, I know all government and related agencies are having issues with staffing. And I know ACHD and ITD in particular, it's really difficult to get feedback from them early on in a process. So the more projects that are coming through this, quasi pre-app process, and then also blocking out more time for those applicants, trying to get ACHD and ITD to those tables, which I would love. That seems like maybe a stretch in wanting to get their commitment to attempt that. But if that is possible, that would be amazing, because we would love to have them get their feedback earlier on in the process than we do currently.
And hopefully you don't have to shop either. And then everybody is hearing exactly what that message is. And we don't get pitted against one another. I don't want ACHD to pit you and I against one another. And I don't want you to pit ACHD and I against one another. We want to be working collaboratively and understand what the goals are and what we have to achieve.
Yeah, this is Richard. So I'm hearing everyone and inclusivity and all. It'd be a great place to invite a neighborhood representative as well. Get in early, and often we do know things that other people don't, believe it or not. So yeah, thank you.
And you're going to see in the process that actually the neighbors will be involved earlier. You're going to see the project at 25% completion. We're going to meet with the developer and say, what did you hear from the neighbors? So that as we get to the 50% to the interdepartmental review, we're including that in the conversation. So it's not a lost message. And you'll see that in some of those visuals.
Yeah, and Andrea, I know you can speak to this all day, every day. So, but I'll walk through this quickly, not quickly, I'm going to go slow. But we're going to show kind of the top is the current process, and then the proposed process for the other types. And I think there's a room to get feedback on here. And I know it's kind of small, but the current process, if it's a staff level application, so it's not going to a public hearing, what we're finding is a staff person or an applicant may come to us with various degrees of quality application, and they can come, they'll talk, and then they'll submit an application, and there's no feedback loop or quality control on the application before it's submitted. So it will be submitted, staff will be directed to write a staff report and then make a decision. In the proposed process, so now things application types 1 and 2. Again, the 1 is the very simple review. So that will probably be similar, where there's just a quick concept review. We go, okay, you're trying to do a temporary sign. These are the things you're going to need. They submit the application. and the decision is made. The type 2s, so this would require, it's large enough in scale where we're going to say we need that interdepartmental review. It may be administrative, but we need to make sure we have fire at the table or solid waste. So again, this first one is called concept review meeting. So we want to talk to the applicant when their idea is only 25% of the way fleshed out. They haven't spent a ton of money. There isn't a ton of pressure to staff to get it through, right? We want to talk to you before when it's a concept, when you're about a quarter of the way to something you think is ready for submittal. Staff will talk and have a meeting with that applicant. They'll come back, they'll take that feedback, they'll come back one more time to staff at what we're calling a mid-process review. So about 50%. Planning staff will review and say, all right, this looks good. You're ready to present, we're ready to talk to our interdepartmental review. We need to tap fire for this now. You have enough refinement to tell us we know the use, we know what you're proposing, we know the scale of it. We're going to go bring this to the other partners. There'll be that interdepartmental review. There'll be some recommendations from there. And then again, it would go to that's when they can finally submit the application. So again, this is adding a lot more front work, but the goal is to really result in an excellent project, that staff isn't all of a sudden reacting to something a developer or an applicant has put forward, say, I already spent my money on it, make it work. We're saying, talk to us at 25%, 50%. Let's bring in the people who are going to have to service you. And then we'll be ready to review your application once you submit it. The next would be our hearing level applications. So again, at the top is our existing process. These are ones that go to public hearing. Again, they'll have a pre-application meeting with staff, and this is varying degrees of refinement, right? They'll come to staff. Some people come with a napkin, some people come with full blown engineering drawings, and it's a variety of things that staff have to react to. They hold their neighborhood meeting. I'm sure a lot of neighborhood people, neighborhood leaders understand this. Sometimes they come with a sketch, maybe they just say something, or they already have a fully baked plan. And then that's when they submit their application. We go through some transmittals, neighborhood noticing, things like that once the application has been submitted. And then you get a staff report and you're scheduled for public hearing. You'll notice the green is kind of when the public gets to be involved. In our proposed process, so this is those type 3 applications that are going to go to a commission or the hearing examiner. We're again, as staff, going to have that initial meeting with the applicant. So it's only 25% of the way there. Staff would give a green light to say, all right, you're ready to speak with the neighborhood, to have your neighborhood meeting. They would come back to staff before they submit their application. And we're working on a process to have a reporting back to staff about the neighborhood meeting to make sure that that voice of what was heard at that neighborhood meeting is reflected later on in the application. It's not just held. So that would be that mid-process review to review the neighborhood meeting feedback. There would be the interdepartmental review. And then finally, they would be cleared to submit their application. That's when, again, the traditional transmittals happen and neighborhood noticing would happen, staff report, and then public hearing. So very similar in terms of cadence and the back and forth. We're just starting the process earlier, and we're not saying you're green lighted to submit until we've spent that time working through the project ahead of time. And again, the last one is pretty similar to the previous, but it's just showing when it goes to city council. Again, in our typical process, you have your pre-app, your neighborhood meeting, you submit your application, staff report, planning and zoning recommendation, city council approval. Our proposed process, meeting much earlier on, having the neighborhood meeting, requiring the applicant to come back to the city to share what they heard from the neighborhood meeting, us refine that application again, interdepartmental review, application is submitted, traditional noticing we're proposing stays the same, traditional noticing, staff report, planning and zoning, and city council. And then the last process is we've heard this a lot, and this has been something that's been talked about for quite a while, is like, how do I know what's going on in my neighborhood? Acela is not the easiest. So we're trying to create a website to make it much more clear and much more obvious. to involve our community early on, as well as to really learn to get that information quicker, especially for those type 2 applications that may not be going to public hearing, but wanting to be aware of if they're happening. So this screenshot is of our tenant. We're still working through it. It's beta, but our online tracking tool so that you'll be more easily able to identify when a project is happening in a certain area of the city. And then I skipped the first 2 bullets, but I think I made that clear. Earlier neighborhood meetings, and then we would require a summary of that neighborhood meeting to be submitted to the city. And I think that's all of it. So perfect for discussion. Marissa?
This is Marissa. So one of my concerns with having the developer report back to the city on the concerns of the neighborhood is that they are not always including all the concerns. And I know that because I've heard developers state neighborhood concerns at public hearings, and it's not all what was discussed at the neighborhood meeting. So I think there needs to be some sort of rather than relying on somebody to report back, comment, some sort of form, I don't know, something that kind of takes out the middleman and lets the neighborhood actually correspond with staff.
I second that. I think that's a good suggestion and something we can, I know we're in the online tracking tool. We're working on a submit feedback directly function. And that could be one, maybe it's, I'm sure we can incorporate neighborhood meetings, submit feedback then. I think the idea is to get the neighborhood feedback before the application is even submitted instead of after it's been transmitted and submitted.
And Shellen has a question. So go ahead, Shellen, followed by Andy.
Thanks. This is Shellen. Can you go back to I think it would be slide 35 or 36 probably. Yeah, maybe the next ones. So I think that's a good point that Marissa made. I think it was Marissa, just figuring out a way to make sure that both the neighborhood's concerns are actually captured or not, and why, from a development application. Other communities that I've worked in have staff at those meetings, not to oppose or, just for no other reason besides to hear. I don't know if that's too costly. I could see how that could be costly, but it's an idea. And then I do feel like there's a point, I think it was to Richard's point, that, if the neighborhood so chooses to have somebody involved at that mid-process review, they don't have a yay or nay position per se, but they would have a similar, they would just be there hearing the changes that have been made since they last saw it, so they can choose to communicate it to their neighborhood, or, I don't know, that's just an idea. I also think that's, neighborhood associations are not paid, so that's kind of a tough ask as well. And then, but it's an idea. Is the 25% initial review, that is like the pre-app meeting and the conceptual meeting. And my concern with that is, it seems like it's going to be hard to do. Maybe one of the architects can better address that. At 20, I'm not comfortable sharing anything at 25% because it's so early and so still up in the air. So I guess that's my concern. Maybe somebody else can speak to it.
Well, I see Mr. Erstad has his hand raised, followed by Ian. So we will hear from them, and maybe they're going to be able to provide some input there.
So Shellen makes a really good point. Conceptually, you start projects, and it's a heavy lift and a long road before you know if you really even have a project. And I agree completely with her that this sort of 25% is a number, but it's not a reality. I think that initial review meeting is when we're ready for an initial review. By that time, the design team has worked enough with the client's program, and the client's worked enough with the contractor to understand what the budgetary constraints are and whether or not there's a project or not. And I think that bodes well for everyone, because why have a series of meetings when you don't have appropriate or accurate information? I wanted to make another comment relative to the neighborhoods and the neighborhoods' concerns about information in neighborhood meetings and that nature. I think, again, the projects come to the neighborhoods when there's enough information to know whether or not the project is a viable project. And when we do neighborhood meetings, we're obligated, and under the current code, under the current ordinance, by the way, which is law, we are obligated to invite the neighbors. And depending on where you are within the neighborhood, in some instances, we are obligated to invite 2 or 3 different neighborhood associations. I think once that invitation is established and it's out there, it's incumbent, and I know people are going to take offense of this, but it's incumbent upon the neighborhoods to have their representative, who is supposed to be that conduit, that link between the process and the neighborhood, to be there and available, and then to also be the arbiter, if you will, of what the developer might say happened and believed happened, and what the neighborhood says and believes happened, which, by the way, a lot of times in almost all of our projects, we're in lockstep. In some of our projects, there's no way you're ever going to be in lockstep. That's such a contentious issue. And so, again, this whole process has been predicated on everybody knowing, everyone having an adequate notification of what we've been doing for well over a year. And we keep getting feedback that nobody knew about this, or nobody is, no one's invited to the table. Everyone in the city has been invited to the table in more ways. The city has done an absolute Herculean job of notifying the neighborhoods and notifying agencies and notifying those of us who deal with the city on a day-to-day basis about this whole zoning ordinance rewrite process. And I just put that out there because if every meeting we start off with that says, well, this group didn't understand what was going on or didn't have a chance, after 4 or 5 neighborhood meetings across the city, I'm wondering what else needs to be done. If you want to be engaged, you'll be engaged. And so in this process list, I agree, get the neighborhoods involved early, but it's incumbent upon the neighborhoods as representatives of their zones to be, if you will, that conduit. And I think collectively we'll all work together, but I don't think we're going to get very far if we're expecting the city to now have a staff person go to every single neighborhood meeting that a project is being proposed in, because it's not going to happen. There's no money. And I don't think there's an appetite for it. So,
and Andy, if I could just respond really quickly to some of the points that you had made. I mean, for our team, especially from a notification and public outreach process, obviously we're all familiar, and it's been a topic of discussion at these CIC meetings many times. Of it is very difficult. You can put a lot of effort into getting the word out about something, and that is very valid. And you can also hear feedback from people that I had no idea that this was going on, and I don't feel like I'm being informed. And that's also valid, because our communication networks and the nature of our lives have become so complex that it's just very difficult to keep everyone in the know. And I think that when we do outreach, our hope is to be able to have people actually use that online tool and explore it a little bit to see what it would look like, to be able to look at a map, and at any given time you can see all of the applications that are currently live near your neighborhood or whatever part of the city you're interested in. our hope is that that can help to bridge some of that gap to really empower people to, yes, we'll still do traditional noticing. Yes, we have neighborhood meetings, but also this is a way that you don't have to navigate sort of the labyrinth to get to the information you need. It's there whenever you want it. And then the email for the planning department will also be attached to that. So if you want to give feedback at the time you're looking at it, the link is right there, and just trying to make that process as smooth as possible.
You guys have done a brilliant job notifying the community, and my hat is off to you. And if I feel like I need to be out there being a champion for what an amazing job the city has done. Every turn of the road, every opportunity you've invited, you've encouraged, you've included, you've given avenues. So hats off. Thank you very much. I'll shut up now.
All right, Ian, then Ben, followed by Roberta.
Yeah, I guess I would probably just reiterate what Andy said. I mean, projects are nebulous and the design changes drastically from beginning to end. So I think the 25% is a good target, but whether or not that's actually the case is another story. One concern I will raise is, at what point is this go to the public, right? If we're requiring a 25% initial design review meeting, the project may not be developed to a degree where it's ready for public viewing. I know that that's been somewhat contentious with some of the builders and developers that I've worked with, that, hey, we had this pre-app meeting. I wasn't quite ready to show this to the world yet. So just something to think about. At what point is that made available? And then kind of the other thing, I think this is a great process, and I guess one, part of me thinks, okay, this is great, and then I get multiple other points to kind of get feedback on the project, and that's all well and good, but we are adding effectively 2 additional meetings to this process, whereas right now we just have a pre-application meeting. So I'd be interested to hear how we're planning, or how the city's planning on kind of staffing up and making sure that this doesn't get bogged down and add additional work to you all who are already very busy. So thank you.
And right before we move on, I think, the 0 to 25% or 50%, I think those numbers we can certainly work with. I think the conceptual design is that Ben comes in and says, hey, I'm interested in doing a multifamily development along State Street. That gives me the opportunity to say, okay, Ben, are you aware that the pathways plan has a multi-use pathway on State Street? So you need to accommodate for that. Our design guidelines say that your building is up front with your parking to the side or to the rear. And we know that the neighbors have asked for a signal at this location, so that I can give you that feedback very early so that you can start to integrate those design concepts very early on. It's not going to be very specific feedback, not yet. So I think that can happen, just he and I talking over the telephone, he and I coming in. Those are very brief encounters, but we have some playroom. So if you guys have some better numbers for us, feel free to throw those out there.
And this is Jessica, if I can chime in just on the staffing front, which this is in the weeds, but to just convey that we are aware in that changing the process and moving up front in that process, so much higher level of review and conversation, that we'd be kind of flopping staffing on that. More staffing in general is needed, but also at this point right now, when you go in for your pre-app, you're starting with staff that are more junior in their career, and then after submittal, it's more senior planners carrying those through to hearing, and we'd be spreading that out more. That you have a group that we're standing up called the Development Services to be that interface with developers and applicants before they're submitting, as well as managing this interdepartmental review committee. It does require more staff, but then also a higher level of professional skills at that point in time too.
All right, so we had Ben, then Drew, then Marissa, and Roberta. So I'm sorry, you'll be after Ben.
Thanks. This is Ben Zamzo, and I appreciated Jessica and Ian's comments on the staffing. That was another concern of mine. I don't have a recommendation yet. I'm staring at this, but the one part of the proposed process that I think would trip Rocky Mountain, our company, up in our types of projects, which are primarily retail. But I do think the new zoning code is going to have a lot more development along the corridors. So they'll have more retail mixed use aspects to it. I can't imagine ever getting to that 50% review before going and sitting down with ACHD or ITD to talk about access and how that's going to affect the project. And I really liked what Andrea said earlier about the interdepartmental review and being able to get ACHD, ITD in the room. So there's no finger pointing. Everybody hears the exact same thing. But I just can't picture having 2 meetings with the city and a neighborhood hearing before approaching them. So I think we would probably approach them independently earlier on in the process, which might undermine some of the intention of getting everybody in the same room at that IDR.
That's good feedback. Thank you. Roberta?
This is Roberta D'Amico. I was thinking that I really like the concept of the online tool before Andy started to speak. And I wanted to ditto what Andy said is from the beginning in the fall of 2020, I participated in a lot of the community meetings that were virtual. Involving neighborhoods or other citizens in some manner, I think will help that, but people are very limited in time. So the online tools are really a great idea. So thanks.
Drew and then Marissa.
Yeah, thanks. Just my thoughts on this, hopefully quickly. I've hosted and coordinated a handful of neighborhood meetings for planning projects. Each and every one of those conversations, and I also go to a lot of neighborhood association meetings, are, I think, effective for the process that ensues. I've found that the cumbersome side or the stressful side is the mapping, the mailing, the synchronization of the timeline, cutoff dates, those types of things. I wonder if there's an opportunity to soften an initial neighborhood meeting requirement to where it's more of a conceptual introduction to a project and a conversation with the community, because again, I think that is going to be informative to a successful project that's supported. But then somewhere in here is slotted in a type of check-in with the neighborhood somehow. And I like what Andy said of how using maybe NAs early on as that conduit. If you could soften that requirement up front on that initial concept conversation so that it isn't, I do find it daunting sometimes. But then when you have something more fleshed out based on that feedback, based on further thought from your own development team, maybe there's a second piece to that. I wouldn't say that's on every one of these strings, these application types, but I would, yeah, that maybe that's a way of echoing what Marissa and Shellen have said about the importance, and Andy, others. I think everyone's kind of made the point of making sure that the neighborhood feedback we get is valuable and at the right point in time.
This is Marissa. I also don't think that city staff needs to be at neighborhood association meetings or neighborhood meetings, I guess. You guys probably don't want to be there either. But I think, something to keep in mind is, like, at least in RNA, we do try to attend as many neighborhood meetings as we can, but we are volunteers and I have to prioritize. Like, the last one was on my child's birthday. So it's like, sorry, kid, we can't go out because I got to go to a neighborhood meeting. Like, you have to make choices. So I think relying on the NA there to be there is not probably the best thing to do. I think NAs try to make as many as they can. But I do think that, like, one thing that could be improved is the letter that developers send out with the notice, because some of them are very detailed and some of them just have absolutely no information other than, like, there's a meeting this date and this time. And so I think like, and when we get those type of ones, I do try to call the developer, or somebody on my board tries to call a developer and ask more questions. But I think, like, are you asking for a rezone? How many stories? Like, there just needs to be like a certain level of info in those letters, just to make them more usable for the community. And that's all.
Esther.
So in my nearly almost 2 decades of being involved with my neighborhood association, I have seen 2 approaches. One where the neighborhood association was never provided any notification. It was when we went into the actual city files and saw that there was a meeting held. And then there have been other instances where the development isn't necessarily proposed within our boundaries, but in an adjacent neighborhood where we have received notification, or it's on the edge and we've received notification typically from the architecture firm that's working on it. And I think that they do it out of, at least out of just making sure that the neighborhood is informed. A lot of times that notification only goes to the folks that live within a certain radius to the proposed project. We saw that as recent as the project for, I think, 11 or 12 townhomes on Hill Road between Collister and 36th Street. So I too agree that I don't think we need city staff at these neighborhoods. I think that maybe the city should strongly recommend that the developer send not just notices to the immediate neighbors, but to the neighborhood association, also recognizing that the neighborhood association does not have direct communication with, depending on the neighborhood. We just don't have direct communication with the majority of our neighbors. So yeah, it's a tough one. But again, I guess I would say that if there's an opportunity for the city to ensure that part of the process, part of the application process is a requirement that you send a notice to a neighborhood meeting notice to the neighborhood association, because I don't, we've got 3 other neighborhood folks here that are actively involved. I don't know if you guys get every single one of them, but it's been inconsistent.
You are required to get them all. And that remains in the code. So it's very clear that not only are owners and occupants within 300 feet required to be notified, the registered neighborhood association is as well.
And if you're not properly notified, then that can be challenged.
That would be a process and procedures error. And so we can send them back to start to redo. Marissa.
And this is Marissa again. Yeah, we've had that happen where we were not noticed and we brought it to the attention and they had to go back to the beginning. And like part of me doesn't like doing that, but the other part is like, if you don't do it, then like, what's the point of having that requirement if it's not going to be adhered to? So it's kind of like teaching somebody the process that they need to follow. But I will say that, like, if you want the neighborhood association there, I occasionally have had people call me before they schedule a meeting to be like, hey, these are the dates we're working with. Do one of these work for you? Can you guarantee that someone from your association will be there? And that's really helpful because there's also like city council hearings, there's P&Z hearings, there's Ada County P&Z. There's a lot of things going on. So if we can, I know it's difficult to line up everybody's schedule, but I think sometimes just reaching out and saying, hey, what date would work for you would be just good to get people to your meeting.
No, that is great. And we are actually coming to a close. So we've got about 5 minutes left, but I did want to let you know that we've got our upcoming outreach for Module 3 beginning on October 13th. So we're going to have 4 in-person events. They'll be located throughout the city of Boise, plus 1 virtual. And so you'll see those dates up above. We'll put those in the minutes for you, but they're October 13th and 17th, which is a Thursday and a Monday. And then we have November 3rd, which is a Thursday. And then I think November 8th is a Monday. And then we're back to November 16th. So we'll make sure that you have that. But before we depart, we also wanted to see how far along the process would you like to be involved? So we've had an initial opportunity to share with you our preliminary thoughts in regard to Module 3. We're going to have the release of that, and then we're going to kick off public engagement. We think that you're probably going to want to know, hey, what did the community say? And what did the city modify as a result of that? Am I correct? Okay. So we were thinking that November's probably not the right time because that's going to fall around Thanksgiving. So we would meet with you in October. As we're kicking off, we can go through some of the more Module 3 questions that you have now that you've had an opportunity to think about that. We can reconvene on December 8th. So that's not going to be our 4th or our 5th Thursday, but that's ultimately going to be the 2nd Thursday. But that's going to fall somewhere between that October and January hearing, because January, we're going to know exactly what we're modifying based on what we heard from our community, which we can share with you on December 8th, modify our code, let you know what that is, obtain your feedback. Then February is going to sneak up on us and we're going to submit our application. We're going to be ready to roll. So those were our preliminary thoughts. Are we on the right track that's going to be the right timing for everybody? So we could meet continuing through January. So that would be October 27, December 8, and January 26th. Yep. Does that sound reasonable? Because we think we're going to have deliverables for you. We will have met with the community. We can share that. We can continue to talk about Module 3, and then we can share with you what we are modifying so that you know what we're moving forward to planning and zoning and city council. We're thinking October 13-ish. It'll be the consolidated draft. So this is going to be your first opportunity to see the entire code put together. And you're going to see how all those components work in conjunction with one another.
And we could maybe have a celebration.
Yeah, and we're going to celebrate.
You might miss us after 3 years.
Okay, so online we have lots of support. I'm hearing lots of support internal to the building as well. And then we also have a visitor. So I want to make sure that we allow them the opportunity. Charlie, do you have anything that you'd like to share with the committee? And you don't have to. I'm just giving you the floor if you'd like to share anything.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. No, I just appreciate the discussion. I'm a newish member of the East End Neighborhood Association Board and trying to raise awareness with neighbors about what it actually is and et cetera. And yeah, just enjoyed following the conversation. I'm definitely looking forward to having a neighborhood specific engagement opportunity at one of our either board meetings or open house related to once the code is actually released, this final draft. So yeah, looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess that is all that we have, unless anybody else has anything that they'd like to share.
Sorry, I was late, everybody. This is Tim Keane, Director of Planning. And I just wanted to close the meeting by, first of all, thanking all you CAC members again for the time you're giving to this. And also mention, we had a meeting, all of us here on this side of the room earlier this week about Module 3. And one thing I wanted to acknowledge that impressed me about it is when I got here 6 months ago, I felt like there was this detachment between everybody here that works for the city and technically, obviously works for all you, a detachment from them and the work itself. You know, that it was heavily consultant driven, and even in answering questions, there was sometimes some hesitancy around answering questions just because of that separation between the staff and the actual work. And we're at a point now where this group of people here is completely owning this. You know, that there is a lot of thought going into and consideration of obviously the regulations themselves, but how people access them and how they work in practice for people in simple ways and more complicated ways. So I really just wanted to acknowledge the way that this group of people that works for you has just jumped into this over the past 6 months, and greatly appreciate the creativity and commitment they've made to it. So thank you and them for this. We're actually in a spot now where if we keep progressing the way we have been, that we perhaps could get this done by next summer. So thank you.